Episode 1. The night the crucifix melted. They say the crucifix didn't fall. They say it wept. And what it wept wasn't water, but something that smelled like blood and is like fire. I didn't believe the stories I read until I stepped into the confessional where it happened. The chapel was locked when I arrived. Father Renaud had left the keys beneath the statue of Saint Lucy. Just like the letter said, the brass was cold, and the air inside a colder, not temperature, but presence, like something had been waiting, undisturbed for years. The wood creaked beneath my boots as I crossed the threshold. Dust hung in the air like incense smoke that had never cleared. Stained glass windows, once vibrant, now looked bruised by time, and at the center of it all stood the crucifix, twisted, deformed, melted. It wasn't legend. It wasn't exaggeration. Christ's face had slumped downward, the eyes disfigured, mouth warped as if caught mid-scream. His arms, once stretched in mercy, had collapsed toward his ribs like he was curling into himself. The nails were gone. The hands had slipped, as if he tried to escape his own sacrifice. And beneath it black wax, thick, hardened, but I could smell it still. Not incense, not rot, burnt sorrow. There was no official record of what happened on August 14th, 1963. Just whispers. One girl entered the confessional. One priest heard her. One crucifix melted. The church blamed humidity. Locals said possession. But the walls say something else. Because when I leaned close, I noticed what I thought were stains on the confession booth. Fingerprints, down scenes of them, burned into the inside wood, as if people tried to claw their way out of that box, as if something inside was not confessing, but consuming. I found the recording tucked inside a hollowed-out Bible in the sacristy, labeled only with a date and the initials L.M. It should have crumbled. It should have degraded. But when I play it, her voice didn't sound human. It began soft, a whisper. "Bless me, Father, for I have remembered, not sinned." Remembered. The priest on the tape began to sob violently, not like a man crying, but like a soul unraveling. Then came the sound. A single, wet crack, like wood splintering under heat. That's when the tape stopped. But in the chapel, the crucifix groaned. It moved. I swear it to you. It shifted just slightly, as if reacting to the tape. I turned off the player and the air snapped back. The birds outside resumed singing. The light returned to normal. But I knew something wasn't finished. This wasn't a miracle. It wasn't a curse. It was a response. And it had waited 60 years for someone to listen again. I'm staying in the convent tonight, alone, with the tape, with the confessional, with whatever heard her speak in 1963 and might want to speak again. If I don't write tomorrow, don't come looking for me, because some confessions aren't meant to be forgiven. They're meant to wake something up. Episode 2, The Girl Who Confessed Without Speaking. I listened to the tape again, this time in the dark. I don't know why I thought that would help. Maybe I hoped that without the distraction of light, I'd hear something new, something clearer. But what I got wasn't sound, it was a feeling. And it started when I pressed play. Dread, not fear. Fear is sharp and sudden. Dread is slow, like a rope tightening around your chest. It creeps in with the voice. That voice. She didn't speak the words out loud. Not truly. You hear them, but they don't pass through air. They slide under it, like prayer crawling beneath your skin. And then, silence. But here's the impossible part. The priest's breathing continued. He responded, "He heard her." I replayed the section, this time isolating the audio. No distortion, no background static. But when I removed her frequency, his voice remained trembling, stammering. He whispered, No, child, that sin is not yours to bear." What sin? Who was she? And how can you confess without sound? I started digging through the convent's archives. Dusty boxes, water-damaged books, forgotten ledgers. Most were unremarkable budget lists, repair schedules, prayer groups. But one file stopped me cold. Infirmary intake report, August 1963. A girl had been admitted that month. No name, just initials, L.M. Same as the tape. Status, nonverbal. Trauma suspected. As unaffected, but unresponsive. And one more note, scribbled faintly in red ink. severe burns on palms, no external cause, burns, palms, as if her hands had touched something divine or damned. I returned to the confessional, though it was darker on the right side, the side where the penitent sits, but not from rot or mold. It looked singed, like someone had placed a candle too close for years. I knelt inside, closed the door. Silence, no presence, no whisper, and out of nowhere my ears popped, like pressure had shifted, though the door never opened. And just then, a breath. Behind me, I turned fast. Nothing. But I wasn't alone. Something had entered the booth with me, and it wasn't physical. It was weight. It was gravity. And then, I felt it. A cold fingertip pressed lightly against the center of my forehead. I didn't scream. I couldn't, because suddenly, I was seeing things I never lived. I saw a girl kneeling in a white dress soaked in ash. I saw a priest clutching his collar, bleeding from the ears. I saw a crucifix melting not from fire, but from shame. Not pain, shame. I bolted out, gasping. The chapel light had dimmed. A thick candle I handlit was burning on the altar, and carved into the pew behind me, in scorched black letters, she confessed with her silence. But something else answered. This wasn't a confession booth. It was a receiver. And the girl, whatever she was, didn't come to be forgiven. She came to deliver a message. One no mouth could speak. One no man could unhear. And now that I've heard part of it, I think on next. Episode 3, the tape that shouldn't exist. I didn't sleep that night. How could I? Not after what I saw in that booth. Not after feeling a fingertip press into my skull like it was marking me. At 3:12 the crucifix on the wall let out a faint crack. Not loud, not violent, just a single, deliberate sound, as if the wood remembered what it once held. I needed answers, real ones, not just visions, not just nightmares. So I returned to the sacristy. There had to be something, a journal, a letter, a report that didn't make it to the official archives. But what I found wasn't tucked in a drawer or behind a holy book. It was inside the altar, a hollow space, no bigger than a shoebox, covered by a false wooden panel sealed with 3 rusted nails. And behind that, a cassette tape, wrapped in cloth. The fabric was old, discolored, and on the center of the cloth, a crude black cross had been painted. No label this time, just the smell of burnt oil and something else, something metallic, unnatural. I shouldn't have touched it. I shouldn't have brought it back to my room. But I did. I Saturday on the edge of the narrow bed, slid the cassette into my old recorder, and pressed play. At first nothing, just a low hum, the kind of ambient sound a room makes when it wants you to think it's empty. And then, a voice, but not the girl's. A man's, tired, whispering, breathing like he was afraid even the air might hear. This is Father Albrecht, August 15th, 1963. The morning after, I frowned. See, Albrecht, that was the priest who disappeared, the one no one could find a death certificate for, the one whose name had been erased from every diocesan file. He kept speaking. I'd in the tape from last night, locked the booth. They must never hear it. The girl didn't speak, but I heard, not her, something else. My hands started shaking. The lights flickered. I could feel the temperature drop again. It wasn't confession, the priest whispered. It was a memory, not hers. Older, too old. It spoke through her, about a war, about blood on heaven's floor, about a crucifix that wasn't supposed to exist. And then his voice cracked. I watched it melt. I heard him scream. He wasn't talking about a statue. He meant Christ. The tape screeched suddenly like it was resisting being played. Then silence. And in that silence, I heard something else. Breathing, not from the tape, from my room. I turned slowly. Nothing. But when I looked back, the tape was ejecting itself, as if something refused to let me finish. I picked it up, still warm. That's when I noticed the back of the cassette was warped, melted slightly, just like the crucifix. And the label, it hadn't been blank after all. A faint, charred lettering, a single word was burned into the plastic. Remember, I'm not supposed to have this tape. I'm not supposed to know this happened. But I do, and I think the tape knows I know. If this is what a priest risked his life to hide, then what he heard wasn't just a sin. It was a secret heaven never forgave. Episode 4. The Vision of a Melting Christ. They say you can't look directly at God and live, but no one ever warned what happens when He refuses to look at you. I didn't dream that night. I hallucinated, but the images weren't random. They had weight, intention, pain. In the vision, I was standing in the nave of the chapel. The pews were full of shadows, kneeling in absolute stillness. There were no prayers, no singing, no breathing, just one sound, the slow, wet dripping of wax onto stone. I turned. The crucifix above the altar was alive. Christ's face was melting, first the eyes, then the nose, then the mouth. But it wasn't fire. It wasn't heat. It was as if something in His presence made even the divine structure reject itself. His lips trembled, then parted, and it turned His face away from the congregation, as if He could no longer bear to watch. I woke up screaming, the sheets soaked in cold sweat. But the worst part wasn't the vision. It was what I found on the floor beside the bed, a small puddle of wax, scented like old incense, and something iron. Later that day, I returned to the chapel. I had to see it again, in daylight, with logic, but logic has no place in that room anymore. I approached the crucifix, and this time I looked into His eyes. They weren't glass, they weren't stone, they were soft, like the lacquer had warped. Blistered. One eye was slightly sagging, not from craftsmanship but from grief. And that's when I saw it. Just behind the altar, buried in the cracked marble, was an imprint, a faint, scorched outline. It looked like a kneeling figure, arms raised, as if begging but twisted, not in devotion, but desperation. And around it, faint letters had been etched into the stone. I traced them with my fingers. He turned his face away, but the cross remembered. I didn't understand what that meant until the room began to hum. Not loud, not audible, a hum that only bones feel. And, ton, a second vision hit me like a wave. I was back in the booth, but I wasn't me. I was wearing a collar. I was Father Albrecht, and the girl, M, was across from me, her face hidden in shadow, but her silence more deafening than any scream. Then she reached through the screen. Her hand passed through the grate like smoke and touched the crucifix between us. The moment she did, it began to melt, not because of heat, because of recognition. Like the wood knew her. The voice returned, not hers, not his. Older, ancient. He was not the only one nailed that day, and not the only one who bled without being seen. The crucifix groaned. A nail fell. Then the light inside the confessional turned black. Not dark, black, like the opposite of light. I gasped awake on the chapel floor, bleeding from my nose. The crucifix hadn't changed, but I no longer wondered what she confessed. I was starting to realize she didn't come to confess. She came to remind the cross, and it remembered. Episode 5. The priest who tried to bury the truth. It took 60 years to find the tape, but only 6 days to realize why someone tried to bury it. They say Father Albrecht vanished the night after the crucifix melted. No funeral, no farewell, just gone. The diocese claimed he had a breakdown. Others whispered he ran to Rome for penance. But now I know better. He didn't run. He tried to hide what he'd heard, and he failed. I found the letter under the floorboards of the sacristy, which beneath an old rotting icon of St. Michael. The envelope had no address, just one line, scratched in shaky Latin. Hoc non est peccatum, est memoria. This is not a sin, it is a memory. Inside was a single sheet of parchment, torn, sweat-stained, barely legible. The ink had bled from tears or worse. It read, "They warned me not to listen again." But her silence, it roared. It echoed through the wood like nails into new flesh. I sealed the booth, boarded it shut, but the walls wept wax the next morning. Forgive me, Lord, I tried to bury what I could not carry. The note ended there, no signature, but something was smudged across the corner, an imprint. Thumb and forefinger, both burned. I went back to the confessional that night. I wanted to see it for myself if it had truly been boarded, sealed, hidden, and that's when I noticed it. The grain of the wood behind the booth didn't match the rest of the chapel. It was newer, poorly covered. I pried at it with a knife. The panel groaned and gave way. Behind it was a second compartment, sealed with rusted nails. Inside, ash and a half-melted crucifix. not the one from the altar. Another, smaller, hidden. It had teeth marks in the wood, and wrapped around its neck, barely holding on, was a twisted silver chain bearing a tag, property of F.A. Father Albrecht's cross. He didn't leave it behind. He buried it here, as if afraid it might follow him. As I stared at the melted figure, I saw something I hadn't noticed before etched into Christ's chest. Right where the heart should be were 5 letters scorched into the silver. O-O-B-N. I don't know what they meant, but as I read them aloud, the booth shuddered, not from the wind, not from age, from inside. And then the wall behind me began to drip, slow at first, then faster, wax black, thick, burning through the wood, just like before. I backed out of the booth, heart hammering, but the floor groaned like it wanted to trap me, and that's when I saw the scratch marks, down scenes of them, inside the confessional door, fingernails, clawing out. He didn't seal the booth after her confession. He tried to seal her in. They told us confession was sacred, that it was a place to leave your sins behind. But what if what she left didn't want to stay behind? Father Albrecht tried to bury it, but you can't bury memory. You can only delay its resurrection. And I think it's waking up again. Episode 6, her sins were not hers. You know that moment when your heart whispers something your mind refuses to accept. I have that moment when I realized the girl, M, hadn't confessed her sins. She'd confessed someone else's. The morning after I found Father Albrecht's crucifix, I returned to the chapel, not to pray. I was past that. I came to read the shadows, to walk the cracks in the marble like lines of forgotten scripture. And then I saw it carved into the underside of the pew where she once knelt. I am only the mouth. 3 words, etched with something sharp. Maybe a nail, maybe a bone. I sat there for a long time, trying to understand what that meant. Only the mouth. Did she hear a voice? Was she possessed? Or worse, was she used? The air around me suddenly dropped. My breath fogged, but it wasn't just temperature. It was presence. Something was watching. So I spoke aloud. I don't know why. Maybe part of me hoped it would answer. Whose sins did you carry? I whispered, and the wind in the chapel sighed back through the broken stained glass. That night, I returned to the tapes, not the original, a second one I hadn't noticed before, hidden behind the baseboard of the altar. The label was smeared, but faint letters remained. Confession-free proxy. Proxy. The voice on this one was different, more distorted, heavier, as if dragging centuries behind each word. And then it said, she bled through for us. She offered her silence as a door. We do not sin as mortals sin. We remember as punishment. The hairs on my arms rose. This wasn't a girl's voice, not even a human one. It was layered, fragmented, like a choir of broken tongues speaking through a single throat. She was born clean, but chosen dirty. We filled her. We poured the old grief into her spine. She wept for sins that no longer have names. That's when I understood. She wasn't confessing a crime. She was carrying a memory, a cursed one, ancient, given to her, forced into her. And the church, they didn't protect her. They used her as a vessel, a spiritual landfill. They had found a way to dump the sins they couldn't cleanse, the secrets they couldn't burn, and she became their living reliquary, a holy girl made unholy by inheritance. That's why the crucifix melted, not from sin, but from recognition. Christ didn't turn his face away out of shame for her. He turned it because he knew exactly what had been done in his name. I closed the tape. My hands were shaking. Behind me, the confessional door opened slowly. On its own, the booth was dark but not empty. I saw the silhouette of a girl, kneeling, still, waiting. She didn't move. She didn't speak, but I heard her anyway in my chest, in my ribs, in the ache behind my eyes. He remembers me now, and so must you. Then she vanished. No scream, no flash, just absence, like a candle blown out in a cave. They thought they could bury their sins in her, but sin doesn't rot. It waits, and it always comes back in the one from the church fears most. A girl who remembers. Episode 7, the psalm that made the walls cry. There are psalms meant to comfort the soul, and then there are those that weren't written for humans to hear. This one was never meant to be sung on earth. It started with a leak. Rain had been falling all night, soft and steady, but when I entered the chapel at dawn, I noticed a trail of water seeping from the wall behind the pulpit. Except it wasn't water. It was thick, murky, the color of old tears and ash. I touched it and flinched. It was warm. No pipes run through the wall. No plumbing. No reason for it to weep. But it was crying, just like the others said it did in August of 1963, the morning after she spoke the psalm. According to an old handwritten witness report buried deep inside a sealed box labeled Liturgical Incidents, Restricted Access, The girl didn't speak her confession in Latin, or English, or Aramaic. The nun who transcribed it simply wrote, "Language unknown, but rhythm divine." They called it a psalm because it sounded like one, but no holy book contains it. No church has ever claimed it, because the moment she began reciting it, the walls began to cry, and one priest screamed so violently his own rosary shattered in his hands. I had to hear it for myself, so I played tape 3 again, slower, this time not for the words but for the cadence, the breath, the intention behind the sound. And that's when I heard it, not in the tape. In the walls around me, they hummed, deep, low, like a throat trying to mimic something it once heard in a dream. Then the voice from the tape began to recite, soft, gentle, and every word made the chapel shift. One of the stained glass windows cracked. A candlestick tipped itself over. The crucifix swayed on its nail, and in the background of the recording barely audible someone else began to echo the psalm. A second voice, not hers, not the priest's, deeper, older, layered with centuries of mourning. He knelt before the throne, not in praise, but in protest. He tore his wings from his own back and offered them as proof. He did not fall. He left. My blood ran cold. This wasn't a psalm. It was a testimony, a verse from something exiled, something divine that refused the order of heaven. And this girl, she wasn't possessed. She was chosen as a witness. She's saying what no choir dares to speak. A history of rebellion, not written in fire but in grief. And now I understood why the crucifix melted, because what hung on it wasn't the only sacrifice heaven tried to forget. There were others, silent, erased, and she had remembered them. The chapel walls cried for over 2 hours. Not rain, not water, memory. And when it stopped, something had changed. The air no longer smelled of incense. It smelled of mourning. And scrawled across the back of the confessional booth, in that same sticky ash from the walls, were 4 words. You are the next. If this psalm was a message, then I was no longer a listener. I was becoming a vessel, and the next verse might be mine to sing. Episode 8, The Child Who Drew the Confession. The boy had never heard the psalm. He had never seen the girl. He had never even stepped foot inside the chapel, but it drew the confession, exactly, in perfect detail, 2 weeks before I ever pressed play. His name was Elias, 10 years old, deaf since birth. Not mute, just preferred to speak through images. The kind of child the world often mistakes for broken, when in truth, he simply saw through a different veil. He was the son of the woman who cleaned the convent's guest rooms twice a week. I passed him in the hallway once, or twisted quiet, always drawing in a little spiral-bound notebook. It wasn't until she came to me, eyes wide, tail with fur, that I realized he was part of this. Father, she said, clutching the sketchbook. Hey, he keeps drawing her, the girl, in front of the cross, and she hesitated. The cross is melting. Father, my throat went dry. She flipped the pages. There it was, page after page. A girl kneeling inside a confessional, her mouth open in a scream without sound. The crucifix above her was dripping, its face contorted just like the one in the chapel, wax poured around her knees. The drawings weren't childish. They were exact, lines etched like someone twice his age. No child should have known the level of anguish that alone rendered it so accurately. But the most disturbing part, on one of the final pages, he drew me, sitting in the booth, tears down my face, holding the cassette in one hand and a bloodied rosary in the other. I met Elias the next morning. He didn't speak. He just handed me another drawing, a door beneath the altar, one that didn't exist, or so I thought. That afternoon, I knelt before the marble altar, traced its edges, pressed my palms flat against the stone, and then I felt it, a faint, shallow groove, almost like a seam. I tapped gently, hollow. The stone was false. I chipped at the ground. It crumbled too easily. Behind it, a wooden hatch sealed shut with rusted bolts. I opened it, and the scent hit me first. Burnt incense, mildew, and something older, like forgotten breath. A narrow ladder descended into darkness. At the bottom, a stone room, no bigger than a crypt, walls lined with melted candles, and hundreds of childlike drawings. Up into the stone, all of her. Some showed her smiling, others weeping, a few, her face entirely missing. One, just one, was different. She stood in front of the crucifix, arms raised, and behind her, down scenes of faceless figures with ways sewn shut, and at the bottom corner of that drawing, scribbled in faint charcoal, I only remembered what he asked me to forget. I stood in silence, the weight of the room crushing me, and, a single page slipped off the wall, floated gently to the floor. It was blank, except for a date. Tomorrow. Elias had never stepped into the chapel, but something had spoken to him, not with sound, not with dreams, but through images of memory not yet lived. And if he was right, then tomorrow isn't just another day. It's a repetition, one that's about to begin again. Episode 9. The nun who covered her eyes. She never spoke about the girl. Not once. Not in 60 years. But when I played the song near, her screamed so loudly, the birds outside the convent went silent. Sister Agnes was the last living witness to the 1963 incident. 89 years old, half blind, her hands trembled even when they were still. She hadn't spoken a full sentence since 1972. The church said it was dementia. The doctors called it trauma. But after what I saw in the chapel, I knew better. This wasn't memory loss. This was refusal to remember. I found her in the infirmary wing, tucked beneath blankets that smelled of old prayers and untouched grief. Her eyes were cloudy but tracking, and as I entered with the cassette player in my hand, she flinched before I even spoke. "Do you know this voice?" "Sister." No reply. I pressed play. Only 5 seconds, just enough to hear the girl's breath and the first syllable of that impossible psalm. Sister Agnes back-arched, her mouth open wide, silent at first, and "Don't look at her eyes." The words tore from her throat like she hadn't used her voice in decades. She thrashed, knocking over the IV stand, clawing at the ear like something invisible was dragging her backward. The nurses rushed in. I backed away, but in that single moment, I saw it, a burn scar across her left palm, long, faint, the same as the girl's. Later that night, I broke into her room. I shouldn't have, but I couldn't leave it, not after hearing what she said. I waited until she slept, moved quietly, and there, in the drawer beside her bed, beneath rosaries and wrinkled prayer cards, I found the cloth, soft, hand-stitched, worn by years of fingers smoothing its edges. On the inside, embroidered in red thread, I covered my eyes to stop the memory. I unfolded it fully. It was a blindfold, the kind worn during ancient monastic rituals when the truth was too holy or too horrifying to witness, when the sin being confessed didn't belong to earth alone. And beneath the blindfold, tucked flat as if to hide it from heaven itself, was a page torn from a journal. Her handwriting. She was not possessed. She was volunteered. They gave her the memory because she could bear it without breaking. But they didn't ask if she wanted it. We were told not to look, that her eyes would carry the stain of the memory. I looked anyway. Then the ink trails off, but the bottom corner was soaked in something dark. Not blood, not ink, wax. Sister Agnes never woke the next morning. The nurse said she passed in her sleep, but I saw the difference. Her face wasn't peaceful. She'd wrapped the blindfold around her own eyes before she died, and her lips were stained black as if something kissed her silence shut. I once thought memory faded with age, but not here. Here, memory ferments, becomes sacred, becomes poisonous, and those who try to bury it, they don't die. They're erased. Now I'm sure of one thing. The girl's eyes never stopped watching. Not in 1963, not in the visions, not in Elias' drawings, and not now. Because when I returned to the chapel tonight, I found the crucifix turned slightly, not away, not down, but toward the confessional, toward where she had once knelt, and maybe still does. Episode 10. The confession wasn't finished. The crucifix melted before the last word was spoken. That sentence had haunted every report, every whisper, every page I'd unearthed, but no one ever asked the obvious question. What was the last word, and why was it powerful enough to make a cross weep like a wound? I returned to the confessional one last time. I brought everything with me, the tapes, the blindfold, the drawing from Elias, and the rusted crucifix bearing the initials L.M.R.P.N. As I stepped inside, the booth groaned like it had been waiting to breathe again. The scent was stronger than before hot wax and sorrow, and when I closed the door, it didn't feel like I had trapped myself in. It felt like I had entered someone else's memory. I Saturday, pressed play, not the first tape, not the second, but the one marked simply, Final Do Not MPLET. The audio hissed like it was resisting being heard, and then her voice, but something had changed. She wasn't whispering anymore. She was pleading, "Forgive me, Father, for I have remembered too much. I was given what should have stayed buried, a memory not meant for skin or soul. They passed it into me like a relic, but I was not made to carry relics." Then silence. 5 seconds, 10, and then a single breath. Inhale, exhale. The worst part was not the pain. The worst part was knowing turned his face away, not from me, but from what I was made to say. The audio stuttered. 10. A voice that wasn't hers spoke next, deeper, infinite, like thunder whispered through teeth. "Speak the final name, or remain devoured." The booth trembled. My recorder flickered. The wax on the walls began to boil. And then her voice again, soft, barely audible. The last word of the confession. I had to replay it 5 times. It was broken, echoed, like syllables torn from across a distance heaven refused to close. "Raphael, forgive." And then the tape melted in my hands. Not overheated, not broken, melted, pulled onto my lap like the Crucifix in 1963. I fled the booth. My hands blistered, my ears ringing. That chapel was different. The candles were already lit out. I hadn't touched them. And the crucifix had turned fully, now facing the confessional like a witness, waiting to hear what was never finished. There, beneath the altar, a new message had appeared in charred writing. The confession never ended. It was only passed on to me. I looked down at my fingers, wax embedded beneath the nails, my skin steaming, and then it hit me. She hadn't spoken the last word. She died before she could finish. That's why the cross melted. That's why Father Albrecht vanished. That's why Sister Agnes blindfolded herself. That's why the voice on the tape still waits. Because the confession isn't over. The memory didn't end. It transferred. And now, I know the last word. It's inside me, pressing against the roof of my mouth, clawing at the edges of my tongue, asking to be born. And I don't know what happens if I say it, but I know exactly what happens if I don't. Episode 11, The Altar That Opened to the Past. They say altars are built to hold the sacred, but what they never tell you is that sometimes altars are built to bury something that should never rise again. And tonight, that something woke up. The word was still in me, the last word. I hadn't said it, I hadn't even whispered it, but it throbbed at the back of my throat like a secret threatening to bleed. I didn't sleep. I couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her, a girl, but not as a child, as a vessel, filled in ash, kneeling at an altar that wasn't made of stone but of memory, and below it, a door, always sealed, at 3:06 a.m. I returned to the chapel. The candle flames bent toward the altar like they were being pulled. I approached slowly, the floor groaning under my feet as if it remembered what had been buried in its ribs. The marble steps were cracked now, blackened around the edges. At the base, Elias drawing one of the girl with the wingless figures behind her was nailed to the floor. I knelt, whispered the first syllables of the forbidden song. The ground shivered, and then the altar began to open. No sound, no thunder. It simply split down the center, revealing a narrow staircase descending into the dark, a space no one had mentioned. No map, no blueprints, not even the priests who lived here for decades. It wasn't built. It was hidden. The smell hit first. Not death, not rot. History, like burned manuscripts and blood-soaked prayers. I descended, the narrow walls pressing inward. The steps were slick with candle wax and something thicker, something older. I didn't dare ask. At the bottom, a chamber, round, stone, all lit, except there was light, faint, pulsing, coming from the far wall. I approached and saw it, a crucifix carved into the stone, but not of Christ, not the way we knew him. This figure had no face, no crown, no wounds, but it was bleeding, and beneath it, an inscription written in ancient Latin. He was not the first, he was not the last. This is where heaven sent the memories it refused to keep. I stepped closer. There were bones beneath the stone, not buried, arranged, kneeling, arms open, fingers broken backwards as if someone had forced them to pray. And in the center of the room, a second confessional, but smaller, no door, just a C carved into the stone and a great face in the wall. And on the wall painted in something that shimmered faintly was a sentence I couldn't look away from. Speak the last word, and the memory becomes flesh again. My body frenzied, because the word was still inside me, alive, hungry. It wanted to breathe. I backed away, choking on air, the chamber spinning. I dropped to my knees and covered my mouth. I couldn't say it. I wouldn't, but something was already listening. Behind me, the sound of bare feet stepping down stone. Slow, soft, rhythmic. The girl, or the one who used her. I didn't turn around, because somehow I already knew. Whatever had been buried here had stayed silent. It had only been waiting for someone like me. Episode 12. The confession wasn't hers alone. The voice didn't echo. It multiplied. When I finally turned around in the chamber beneath the altar, there was no girl, just a shadow kneeling on the stone seat of the ancient confessional. A shape with no face, no hair, no features, but I knew it was her, or rather, what had been speaking through her all along. And when it opened its mouth, I heard downstairs of voices, some male, some female, some ancient, and some that sounded too tired to be human anymore. She was never the sinner, they said. She was the parchment. We were the ink. I backed into the far wall, heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my ears. Who are you? I whispered. We are what your priest could not burn. We are the memory that refused the flames. I wanted to run, but the air was so thick it held me in place. And then, the shadow stood, its limbs cracked like old wood adjusting to light again, and from its back, two slits began to open like wings that had once been there, torn away by force. Suddenly, the entire room shuddered. The wax along the walls ignited, not with fire but with light so white, it felt like grief made visible. And along the ceiling, I saw names begin to form in smoke. Albrecht, Agnes, Elias, May, and Tun, L. She was the first, they said, but not the last. And then I understood. The confession wasn't a single act. It was a chain, each link a new vessel, each vessel another attempt to speak what could not be spoken. Until the final word is complete. The church didn't bury a sin. They buried a continuation. And now the chain had reached me. I felt it in my chest, in my throat, pressing up like a scream in a voice that was not mine. You opened the altar. You unlocked the silence. Now you will finish what she began. No, I whispered, trembling. I'm not her. You don't have to be. You only have to speak. We are already inside. The crucifix on the wall split with a deafening crack. From it poured a stream of molten wax, forming a circle around my feet, trapping me. I fell to my knees. The last word it was rising again, a shape behind my tongue, pressing outward. I bit down, drawing blood, and then the shadow knelt across from me, not demanding, not threatening, but pleading. We tried to speak through saints, through martyrs, through children, but they broke. You are broken already. That is why we chose you. I opened my mouth, and for a moment, the chamber went utterly still. The voices stopped, the wax frenzy mid-drip. The stone beneath me felt hollow like it was listening, but I didn't speak the word. I asked a question. Who did you belong to before all this? The shadow raised its head slowly. We belonged to him, but it turned his face away. Then it vanished, not like smoke, like a page torn from scripture cling, immediate, final, and the air lightened. The wax cooled, the crucifix reformed, but the word, the final word, remains, still in me, still waiting, because the confession was never hers alone. Now it's mine, and the only question left is, what happens when I speak it? Episode 13. the crucifix that didn't melt alone. I thought the crucifix in the chapel was the only one. I thought her confession one that burned through marble, flesh, and memory only reached this place. I was wrong. It began with a phone call I wasn't meant to receive. A nun from northern Italy, trembling voice, static in the background like a storm, was whispering through her line. "Is this the priest from St. Ellory's?" I hesitated. "Yes, we had an incident. A crucifix. It wept wax, melted without heat. When?" I asked. She took a breath. "2 nights ago, at exactly 3:06 a.m. That was the same hour the altar opened here. The same hour I descended into the crypt. The same hour I nearly spoke the last word. It couldn't be coincidence." And then she said the words that broke whatever disbelief I had left. There was no one in the chapel, except a girl, deaf, kneeling. She didn't speak, but we all heard her from inside our minds. I dropped the phone. I'm mourning. I had 5 more reports. Portugal, Argentina, Poland, the Philippines, Ethiopia, each from a different chapel, each describing the same impossible event. Crucifixes melting without fire. At that same moment, while a child or a woman always silenced it beneath it. I gathered the evidence. Photos, recordings, testimonies. Each showed the same grotesque melt, but the distortions matched something chilling. They looked like faces trying to scream, mouths opening wide, eyes sagging, as if the figures on the cross were not crucified but pleading. And then came the 7th report from a monastery in southern France. No one witnessed it, but they found this carved into the floor beneath their altar the following morning. The word passed, the memory spread. I locked myself in the chapel that night. The words still burned beneath my tongue like a buried match. Unspoken, alive, patient. I lit no candles. I sat beneath the crucifix and waited. At 3:06 a.m., the bells didn't ring. They screamed. Their sound warped, metallic, like metal bending under grief. And then the wax returned, dripping, but flowing in a slow, deliberate spiral around the altar. And just like before, I wasn't alone. This time, she stood at the doorway. The girl, her white dress was soaked, her feet bare, her hair dripped with something that looked like holy water gone sour. But her eyes, they were no longer silent. They were full of memory. Mine, Albrecht's, Agnes, hers. They thought it would stay in one place. She whispered it with her mouth, but inside my skull. But memory is not still. Sin does not sleep, and confession is a contagion. She reached into her chest, pulled out a rosary made of wax, handed it to me. When the last word is spoken, "This melts too, and he will have to listen." The crucifix above me groaned. It didn't melt. It bent, as if preparing to fall forward, to step down, to intervene. And then the wax rosary in my hand warmed, not from my skin, but from something inside it waiting. The word, the final one, still inside me. But now I know the truth. The crucifix in St. Ellory's wasn't the only one. It was only the first. And if I speak the word now, they all fall together. Episode 14. The final word was not forgiveness. We were taught that all confessions end with absolution, a blessing, a breath, a return to peace. But hers didn't, because the final word she carried, the one passed from voice to voice, altar to altar, was never meant to forgive. It was meant to remind. I spent the day reading scripture not found in any Bible, margins scrawled by excommunicated mystics, letters buried in the Vatican's forbidden, archive-leaked, redacted, burned, then remembered again by those too faithful to forget. They all spoke of one thing, a name once heard in heaven. They caused the choir to stop singing, a word so heavy with divine guilt that no angel could speak it without weeping wax. And I knew that was the word inside me, not a curse, not a prophecy, a reminder of what heaven chose not to acknowledge, of the pain it labeled heresy, of the martyr no one canonized. That night, I returned to the chapel. No candles, no prayers, just silence. I brought the wax rosary with me. It pulsed faintly in my palm, like a second heart-on that didn't beat, but ached. At 3:06 a.m., I stood before the crucifix. It didn't groan this time. It watched, and I realized it always had, not because Christ was ashamed, but because he was still listening, waiting. waiting for the word to return to him. I knelt, pressed the rosary to my lips, and I spoke the first syllables. The temperature dropped instantly. The walls wept, the stained glass cracked inward, as if the saints depicted. They could no longer look down on what was about to be said. And then I felt her behind me, the girl, or whatever remained of her. She placed her hand on my shoulder, gentle, not demanding, and whispered, not aloud, but straight into my marrow, "You do not speak this for yourself. You speak it so that he will never forget." I opened my mouth, and the word did not come out as a sound. It became light, a piercing, searing radiance that didn't shine at accused. The crucifix began to melt again, but this time, not in sorrow, in recognition, and on the wall behind the altar, the wax spelled itself into a single phrase. "You did not forget me." Suddenly, the entire chapel breathed. The pews groaned. The ceiling flickered with moving shadow swings, broken and burning, reforming above me, and I heard a voice, not hers, not mine, his, faint, cracked, almost like it didn't believe he still had the right to speak. I turned my face away because I could not bear to watch what was done in my name. Not thunder, not judgment, but something worse. Shame. The crucifix cracked down the center and fell, not with violence, with relief, as if it had waited 60 years for this word to be said, and now that it had been spoken, the structure could finally break. The rosary in my hand dissolved, not into ash, into petals, white, fragrant, carrying the scent of something holy, and finally forgiven, but not by heaven, by her. I am no longer just a vessel, I am a witness, and now, so is heaven, because the final word was not forgiveness, it was, remember, episode 15, final, the sin that God couldn't burn. There are sins we confess, there are sins we conceal, and, ton, there are sins too sacred to forgive and too heavy for even God to destroy. This was one of them. I returned to the chapel at dawn. The floor was littered with the remains of the crucifix, no longer molten, but crystallized, as if the guilt had hardened into something solid, permanent. Above the altar, the wall remained scorched with a final message. "You did not forget me." I Saturday in the front pew, hands trembling. Raw. I had spoken the word, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something unfinished still pulsed inside me. That's when the wind changed. Not from the windows, from beneath the chapel. I descended into the hidden chamber once more. The stone walls were breathing now, not metaphorically, breathing inward, outward, like lungs beneath earth. And in the center, where the ancient faceless crucifix had stood, there was now a flame, but it didn't flicker. It hovered, still, alive. It wasn't heat I felt. It was memory, burning, and the flame whispered, not with words, with understanding. This is the memory they tried to set ablaze, the one they offered to fire, but it would not burn. I saw them, visions in the smoke. The girl, kneeling with wax in her eyes. Father Albrecht, writing his confession with trembling hands, knowing no fire could erase it. Sister Agnes, blindfolding herself to forget what she saw when heaven blinked. And me, holding a word I was never meant to carry, but now I understood. This wasn't a punishment, it was a preservation, because some sins are not meant to be erased. They are meant to be witnessed. The flame pulsed once, twice, then split into 7 smaller tongues, each one lifting upward, passing into the ceiling, into that air above. I ran back up the stone stairs, and as I reached the chapel, I saw them, 7 candles, burning on their own across 7 pews. No one had lit them, but each flickered beside a name carved into the wood. Albrecht, Agnes, Elias, mine. 2 more names I had never seen before, but I recognized one, the 7th, Raphael, the name the girl had nearly spoken, before that original tape burned itself away, a name heaven turned its face from. That's when I saw the final sign, at the back of the chapel, beneath the cracked stained glass, a new crucifix, simple wood, untouched, unmarked, but beneath it was a basin of black wax, hardened now, quiet, and beside it, a single inscription burned into the stone floor. If he will not burn it, then you must carry it. I understood. This synthesis memory was never meant for fire, because fire forgets, but we remember. we carry, and by doing so, we remind heaven of the ones it turned away from, the prayers it ignored, the children it marked, the confessions it never answered. I left the chapel as the sun broke across the horizon. For the first time in weeks, I felt warmth, not peace, not salvation, but weight, and a voice in my chest whispered softly, reverently, "You are not cleansed, you are not absolved, you are the archive." And so, I write this, not for forgiveness, not for warning, but to remember the sin that God could not burn, because it was never his to destroy, it was ours to carry.